Good afternoon and welcome to the British Chambers of Commerce and Chamber Customs second in our International Trade Week webinar series on understanding EU CBAM. We're just going to give people a moment to join the room. That's happening right now, and then I'll be right back with you. Just give us a beat and we'll be back with you in a moment. If you've just joined us, welcome to the British Chambers of Commerce and Chamber Customs second in our International Trade Week webinar series on understanding EU CBAM, what UK traders need to know. People have now joined the room, so we'll get kicked off. By saying, good to have you here. I hope today is going to be very interesting for you, where you'll learn a bit more about CBAM and also some of the tools that are available and support that's available to help you to navigate this new regulation from the European Union. And of course, something that's going to be growing out internationally into UK CBAM and no doubt other country carbon border adjustment mechanism programs in the months and in the years ahead. So who are we joined with today? Today we're joined by myself, Liam Smith, Director of Trade Facilitation at the BCC, Emmanuel Gianquito, Head of Training and Consultancy at Chamber Customs, our sister company, and also by Victor Perez Prieto, co-founder and CEO of Carbon Glance, who are a very interesting tech company startup that we've been speaking to and working with just to see how we can present that information and help businesses to continue to understand the changing embedded carbon values in their supply chain and finished production lines. Before we move proper into the webinar and its content, I did want to give you a bit of parish news up front about a conference we have coming up in March, 20th of March 2025, called Driving International Trade. This is a conference that we, prior to lockdown and COVID, we regularly held each year, and we're bringing it back. The time's right. You can see that we're supported here by Department of Business and Trade, UK Government and ICC United Kingdom, as well as Chamber Customs, and our headline sponsor of Lloyds Bank. That's coming up. You can scan the QR code. You will get that in the deck. If you're interested in attending that conference, then the way to let us know is by indicating your interest, and we'll get back to you. It is an exclusive conference. It will have limited numbers, and so we're doing a filtering process in terms of who ought to attend. So enough from me for now. I want to hand over now to Emmanuel, who's going to say a bit about Chamber Customs. Then we'll hear from Carbon Glance and from Victor on Carbon Glance, and then we'll come back into the detail proper. So Emmanuel, over to you.
Thank you, Liam, and good afternoon, everybody. So I have the pleasure of looking after training and consultancy at Chamber Customs. We were set up by British Chambers a few years ago, and we specialize in the niche space of customs and everything related to moving goods in or out of the country. So as a consequence, CBAM falls well within our scope, and we've been already helping clients in the UK and some abroad who have been asking about how to comply with the regulation. We look after training as well. So we provide bespoke and off-the-shelf training with a focus on compliance when it comes to regulations to do with import-export. And of course, we have a brokerage system. We actually do customs declaration, transit declarations, and basically all the admin side of moving your goods. We are supported by our wonderful network of chambers across the country, and we deliver locally to traders with an overall support that is central. So I think that's enough from us. Those are the three things we do: declarations, training, and consultancy. There is more information if available if you need. That's enough from me. And Victor, can I come to you for a quick introduction of Carbon Glance, please?
Thank you, Emmanuel, and also to Liam for the introductions. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor Perez. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Carbon Glance. To explain you very briefly who we are and what we do, we are a UK-based startup helping companies comply with their CBAM reporting obligations, but also exporters to the EU, helping them generate the data that they need to supply to provide to their EU-based clients. Our team combines different areas of expertise, which are the ones that you can see on the screen. Mainly, we are experts in carbon accounting. Also, we have a lot of expertise in sustainable finance, climate law, environmental economics, and of course, in software engineering, because we provide our support through digital tools.
Thank you very much, Victor. Just before Emmanuel gets into the detail and kicks off that area, I just want to remind people about the Q&A function. There is the opportunity for you to ask questions of our panel. And just to go through the agenda as well, we'll look at the scope of CBAM, the key stages in the development of CBAM, because it is early days for the EU, but it's progressing in stages. So we'll get into the detail of that. Some of the reporting methodology that we're going to make available, some of the recent changes, because it is dynamic as a regulation, and so there are some updates on that have happened in the most recent past. We'll look at how we can help you if you need help, and move on to the Q&A. Now, the whole thing is being recorded. It will be packaged up and sent to you as give you access to the recording after the fact, and also to any of the slide decks that we have here. We can see each other as you can see us. Nobody can see you in the recording, so don't be concerned by that. But we really encourage the Q&A part of these webinars can be the most interesting, frankly, where we bring out the nuances and the real experience that people are having and dealing with CBAM right now. So please get busy on asking your questions. You can ask them anonymously or otherwise. Either way, it makes the third part, if you like, the final third of this very interesting. So please do that, and we'll hear from you later. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Liam. So as Liam was mentioning, the CBAM is a carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is introducing. This mechanism applies to goods that are carbon intensive in their production, and what it tries to do, it tries to price the carbon that is emitted during the production. The idea behind the scheme is to encourage cleaner industrial production in non-EU countries. This is the reason why this mechanism kicks in when non-EU products cross the border. And actually, the declaration that is required, as we will see in a minute, is, as we like to say, a bit like a tax return. Actually, importers in Europe will have to say how much carbon they're introducing in the Union, and depending on the relative weight of that carbon to other products, they might have to pay a tax. So the product in scope in the EU CBAM, and let's focus that we are talking about the EU version of this scheme. As Liam mentioned, there might be others coming soon. The UK is thinking of a parallel scheme. But in the EU, the products in scope fall into the categories of iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, hydrogen, and cement. So the way we look at that, these are the categories that we all understand. And then there is a very specific list of commodity codes. And that is the main important concept. So takeaway number one, we look at the commodity codes that we are importing into Europe to decide whether the products are in scope or not. Now, because this is a brand new scheme, it's been introduced in stages. So we have a phased approach from 2023 when it started to 2026 when the transitional period will end. During this transitional period, all the EU is doing is collecting data. In short, no European importer is paying any money. Taxes are not being paid yet. And the reason is quite simple. The EU is collecting data to check that it works, to check that this scheme works as intended. So the first reporting period ended in January this year, and that is, on a quarterly basis, the importers have to continue reporting on their imports. What happened then in July 2024 is that we could no longer use default values. There's a lot of talk about default values. What those are basically values that can be declared in the absence of real measurements, in the absence of real calculations. So the EU understood that at the beginning, companies were not ready with those measurements, and so allowed importers to use standard default values. Now, at the end of July 2024, the ability to use default values ended. However, the rest of the markets were not ready with calculations. So as a bit of a compromise, if you like, the EU is still allowing up to 20% of the values provided to be based on default data, estimated data, data that has not been properly calculated. We'll go back to that point because that's probably the most controversial point and the main pain point, if you like, of the EU CBAM. Now, the transitional period will end in 2026, and from that point on, real payments will have to be made. So that's the point where actually, if you like, the impact will be felt. However, before 2026 and from today, European importers are being pressured by the EU to submit their reports as accurately as possible. And what happens is that the European importers cannot do that without information from their suppliers. And this is where the EU regulation hits the producers or the processors in the UK. Now, one thing that is very close to my day-to-day work and to my heart is the fact that UK exporters are under pressure to provide figures. But this kind of responsibility is what we define a commercial responsibility. Technically, a UK company is not under the jurisdiction of the European Union because we are a third country. However, so actually the regulation does not apply legally to a UK company, but it applies from a commercial point of view, because of course the UK company will need to provide the information to satisfy their clients in Europe. So the responsibilities of a UK exporter is to provide these figures, is to provide a list of products and resulting CN code, common nomenclature code, and to explain the production routes and basically declare the emissions expressed in tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of product. That's the end of the responsibilities for a UK exporter. Now, it sounds a lot easier than what it is. It's not incredibly difficult, but that is the end of the responsibilities. The EU importer, so the importer of record into the European Union, will have to submit a formal report to the European Union to actually say how much carbon they are importing. And there is guidance from the EU. There's lots of guidance, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and I'm not exaggerating, on how to do that. There are reporting templates, there are guidelines, there are appendices, there are exceptions. And it's not a straightforward thing because, as we like to remind people, this is a tax return. There are clear regulations that must be followed. And so there is a lot of confusion going around on who needs to do what. So that's why we like to clarify. We have to provide information and the EU company needs to report them. Now, I was going to mention DDP and I just saw a DDP question appearing. So I'm just going to mention it right now. When we are selling DDP and then we are actually taking on board as the UK party the responsibility of the importer of record, then we become liable for making that CBAM declaration in Europe. Now, this is a little bit more complicated than what we're going to cover in this webinar. But in short, If you're established in the EU with a company and you are the EU importer of record, you will need to do a full CBAM declaration. And if you're using a fiscal representative in Europe, then your fiscal representative will have to do a CBAM declaration on your behalf. And we assume that there will be a recharge arrangement so that any tax or duty that they pay on your behalf will be recharged to you. So DDP, if it wasn't complicated enough before, has become a little bit more difficult. Right. So Liam mentioned a reporting methodology. So one of the things that we believe strongly is compliance. So Chamber Customer Service, and as a company of the BCC, is very much compliance led. So we don't believe that it's enough to just provide a set of numbers. We believe that it's important that as an exporter, you have a reporting methodology in place where you document the approach that you take to actually calculate your CBAM emissions, and basically what's behind the figures. After 2026, we envisage that there will be audits and there might be checks by the national authorities to actually ascertain that the numbers provided are based on something valid and they've not just been made up. So in our view, a reporting methodology has to cover various aspects. We like to, first of all, understand whether you are a producer of main products or a processor. Are you forging metal? Are you creating fertilizers from scratch? Or are you processing a bar of metal and turning it into screws and bolts? That's the difference between the two. The second thing, which is really challenging, is to understand what goods are in scope. What are the products that you are purchasing? What are the precursors? What are the products that you are adding? And what are the products that you create? What are the resulting products of your production processes? What's in scope of CBAM? And CBAM is quite strict. We can't just say, oh, I'll just do the calculations for those screws that I export to Europe, and the rest of the stuff, I'll just forget about it. Unfortunately, that's not possible. We have to look at the entire facility. We need to understand the boundaries of your production facility. What are you doing in-house? What are you outsourcing to other parties? Do you have another company doing the galvanizing for you? Do you have another company doing part of the process? Because we need to understand how that impacts your final product. We then need to select a sensible reporting period, and for that we need to look at financial records, we need to look at production records, we need to look at stock, inventory, we need to look at energy consumption. So it can be quite delicate, and we need to be strategic about how we choose a reporting period. Then we have to do the data collection, and we're going to come back to this point when we ask Victor his opinion on how easy it is to get the information in, because that's where we're getting a lot of the pain. We need to collect data from our own processes, but also from our suppliers. So if you are buying metal bars from somewhere else, they come with embedded emissions, and we need to understand what comes in and then what we add. We then have probably the more technical part of the calculation, which is the emission apportioning. There are specific rules on how we can aggregate or disaggregate products and production processes, and we need to think strategically on how to do that to get a set of figures which is representative and it's not manipulated, and something that could stand scrutiny when we inform our clients. Now, this is probably the most important part, because let's face it, the way we are heading is that depending on the weight of carbon that you report in your product, once your European importers start to pay tax based on that, your product might be commercially more or less interesting, simply more or less expensive, simply because of how it's been manufactured. So we really need to be careful about how we report that information. So that's our suggested approach in terms of reporting methodology. Now, to me, the important question is, where does the information come from? Because I can tell you, with all the customers we're helping, understanding what needs to be done is not the challenge, and we can help understanding that. The problem is actually to get the information. Step one, facility production data. So actually, you will need to be able to interrogate financial data and ERP data to understand what you have processed in a reporting period. Energy consumption information, all the sources of energy, whether you buy them off grid or whether you make your own, you might have solar panels or wind turbines to make energy, that will need to be accounted for. And last but not least, precursor information, information that actually is linked to the products you are bringing into your factory. And at this point, I'm just going to hand over to Victor, because this is where there have been some changes lately, and it's quite important that we understand what we can and what we cannot use in terms of information coming from outside.
Thank you, Manuel. So I'm gonna speak now about the other side of the equation, if you want, what has happened lately in terms of obligations for the EU importers. Because as Manuel mentioned back then, the legal obligation for CBAM applies on the importers, not on the exporters to the EU. So the main change that has happened, especially during the last reporting period, the October reporting period, was that, as Manuel already mentioned, the default values were no longer permitted to be used by the importers. This means that they had to start using actual data. However, there is this quantitative limit of 20% that still was possible. But let me explain to you a little bit what this means in practical terms. So what this means is that if you are a producer of CBAM goods outside of the EU, and your production process emissions for the CBAM goods that you are producing do not exceed 20% of the overall product's emissions, then you are permitted to still use the default values, to still use the standard values provided by the Commission. However, this doesn't mean that actual data is not needed, because still actual data for the rest of the supply chain will have to be collected for those particular CBAM goods. And just to clarify, by complex goods, we mean, or we refer to CBAM goods that have been produced with other CBAM goods themselves. So essentially, the data collection for those precursor goods, the CBAM goods that were used to produce those other CBAM goods, still needs to happen. Now, if the default values were no longer permitted, what could importers use to report their emissions data? They had to use either the EU method, which is the method that we'll explain later on, or the other option that they had is to use alternative methods. The Commission refers to them as equivalent methods to the EU method. This equivalency has not yet been clearly defined by the European Commission, but it's important to remark that these alternative methods to the EU method, which is the one that should be applied after 2024, are only permitted actually until the end of this year. I'll explain a little bit more about it later, but the other main change, or the other major change that occurred during the previous reporting period, was that because the default values were no longer permitted, importers had to start engaging with their suppliers. Now, with the default values, an importer could basically generate a CBAM report by using the default values, and did not have the obligation to engage with their suppliers, because these default values were published by the Commission. So they had access to them, and they could include them in their reports. Now this changed. With the new reporting period, they have to engage with their suppliers in order to obtain the actual data, because there is no other way to do this than asking this data from their suppliers directly, mainly from the exporters to the EU. Now the question remains, if we move to the next slide, what happens when this actual data was not submitted? And let me be clear, this situation was very common, especially during the last October report, because it was the first one with the obligation to use actual data. So in those cases where importers were not able to submit actual data, the rule was that they had to report emission values of 0. And in addition to this, they had to provide additional information justifying why this actual emissions data was not provided. And on top of this, they also had to provide evidence, to submit evidence via the CBAM registry, which is the main registry that they use to submit their reports. They had to provide evidence on the let's say the attempts that they did to collect this actual data and prove that they actually tried to collect this data. Now, what we are observing at the moment is that flexibility regarding submission of CBAM reports later than the permitted deadline, or even submitting actual data that exceeds the 20% permitted, flexibility on this actually depends on the national competent authorities. At the moment, if we move one step ahead, at the moment, each member state has a different national competent authority, and the competence to enforce CBAM relies on them. So we are observing certain national competent authorities like the Dutch NCA, who is not very flexible regarding the submission of CBAM reports after the official deadline. And also, for example, the Austrian NCA is actually permitting, or has permitted, importers to submit reports with actual data that exceeded the 20% threshold, whereas other NCAs prefer to submit emission values of 0, as I mentioned before, instead of going beyond the 20%. Now, of course, if an importer does not comply with any of these requirements, then NCAs are starting to notify declarants about the possibility of initiating a correction procedure, which is the first step to ultimately impose a penalty. Now, what is going to be the major changes for the next reporting periods? First, as I already briefly mentioned, the next reporting period will be the last one where alternative approaches to the EU method will be permitted. So as from 2025, only the EU method will be allowed for measuring actual data. The second major change that is coming for the next reporting period, and that was announced by the Commission on its latest Q&A, is the establishing of a new portal section within the CBAM registry that will enable exporters to the EU to submit their emissions data directly to that portal. This is crucial because this will essentially prevent them of having to share this data separately with each of their EU-based clients. However, rules on how this will work still need to be specified. And the last major change, which is also very crucial for you to know, is that as from January of 2025, importers will be able to apply for authorized CBAM declarant status, and this will happen also within the same CBAM registry. Why is this relevant? Because any EU importer that is importing or that imports CBAM goods into the European Union will no longer be able to make those imports after 2026 if they are not, or if they have not been granted the status of authorized CBAM declarant, which means that you, as exporters to the EU, won't be able to sell those goods to your clients unless they are authorized CBAM declarants.
Thank you, Victor. That's that's an interesting set of dates. I'll just put them back on because it's really really interesting. I like the idea. Just as a clarification on the opening of the registry, we were discussing this previously, is something that has been announced but has not been explained or detailed yet. We don't have the details of that yet. And
indeed.
Yeah. And also the fact that the registry is available, if I understand it correctly, is that an exporter can share the information through the registry, but they can also continue to share them directly with EU importers on an individual basis. So it's just
correct,
two different
exactly.
ways.
Indeed, this will be optional for those exporters that want to reduce the burden of having to share the same data with multiple clients.
Perfect. That's great. Fantastic. So what I wanted to do, unless Liam, you wanted to do any questions at this point, I wanted to talk about how we can help.
Yeah, I think that would be appropriate. And then we'll come to questions. Just a reminder for people, we have a few questions stacking up there, but there's room for a few more. You know, a couple we've already answered in the presentations, but we'll come back to them and address those. So if you have any questions, please load them up there. But let's go on and talk about the help that's available, Emmanuel.
Great. So what we've done at Chamber Customs and is basically put together something to help UK companies who have products that fall within the scope of the EU CBAM and need to basically do these calculations and satisfy the requirements. So we basically split it in 3 steps. We can do a visit to the premises, be that a physical factory tour or a remote visit, depending on how complex the production processes are. That allows us to understand a little bit of the, you know, what happens in that factory and to understand the mechanism. We have then a period of time to work with the team to actually understand and gather all the necessary information, guide the team as closely as possible in obtaining the information from their suppliers, get all the information and actually crunch the data and put together a monitoring and reporting approach. But within that monitoring and reporting approach, what we have is a calculation, an accurate calculation that can be shared with the customers in Europe. So those are the steps of our work. Now, this is where we have been using the solution. We looked around quite a lot on the market to see what solutions were available, and we've been using the solution that Carbon Glance created, and it actually works quite all right for us. So what you can see here, it is purposefully quite small to actually show you the kind of visual representation of how the different elements would flow. So you have energy, you have CBAM precursor, you have non-CBAM precursors, and you can see how they all flow into the products that is created, that is produced by this production process. So what we have here is, for example, the fact that we're using default values, and you can see, because there is like a very nice visual representation of that, the fact that, for example, for this particular product, we don't have actual values and we have a default information. And on this very simple diagram, you can see that flows through into a final product. Now, what's really interesting that we can do for you is actually help you understand how that default product flows into the final one, and what's the weight of that default, using that default value into the calculation for your final product. So we know that because we didn't have the information for the precursor, which actually in this diagram is the only precursor, the weight of that, when we take everything else into consideration, is 92%. So actually we have a product that relies 92.39% on default data. And as Victor was explaining before, this is not actually, this is not good enough. And Victor, do you want to expand on this, on how the software does this work?
Sure. So essentially what Emmanuel has been showing is a digital schematic representation of a factory. And this primarily represents everything that goes into the CBAM production process, and basically what goes out, which is the produced CBAM goods with their associated emissions, automatically calculated through the use of the tool. So essentially what the tool does is allow the user to represent the installation, and then everything related to the carbon accounting part of things is automatically handled by the tool. And also in line, and this is very relevant, with the EU monitoring methodology, because as I was mentioning before, a specific method, specific rules have to be followed in order to make sure that the data that gets generated is actually correct. Because keep in mind that currently there is no obligation to do so, but as from 2026, there will be an obligation for verification, for verifying the data that you submit to your clients. And this type of schematic diagrams allows you to keep the data stored, to give any potential third-party verifier really good insight on how the calculations were performed, or on what goes into your CBAM production processes, and very relevant and very importantly, how the emissions and the quantities are attributed. I think Emmanuel mentioned before that in order to comply with the CBAM method, you need to attribute quantities of the inputs that you use in your factory in order to attribute emissions. And this is primarily what we are observing here. In this case, we only have one single CBAM production process, but you could have multiple. And the tool allows you to represent that complex reality.
And thank you very much. I mean, you know, as consultants, we have found this tool very useful. Of course, you still need to know what you're doing, and you need still to understand, you know, how everything hangs together. But it's definitely an interesting tool. But one thing I would like to highlight, in this example here, we have a better situation with a simulated, but it's a better situation where actually from this supplier, name obscured, from Germany, we actually received actual information. So we know that the amount of carbon that was added in this 1.3 ton of whatever metal product that is, metal bars probably, that flows into the final product. And in this example, actually, we have something that is green, that is actually contains an amount of estimation that is allowed by the EU. Now, what I'd like to highlight is, like, this is not just a reporting mechanism. Doing a study on production and understanding the level of carbon embedded, actually, as I mentioned at the very beginning, can make your product more interesting. So actually, we can take this opportunity to use CBAM in its true spirit and actually see, is there something that I can do to lower the emission? Can I use greener energy? Can I use a cleaner product coming in, so that not only I am in line with the reporting, but I can overall bring these figures down, and I can make my product competitive on a carbon point of view, which makes it cheaper when it comes to you know, to the import part. I thought, you know, we shouldn't lose track of that, in my opinion. So we showed you a couple of easy ones, and this is more likely, you know, this is more like what we see on a daily basis in terms of the complexity of precursors, different production processes, and different resulting products. So I just thought we put it out there because it can get quite complex depending on how many products and how many production processes you have. So in short, you know, just to conclude in terms of the help that is available, what we can do is to offer support that is expert backed and is compliant. We can offer information, we can offer assistance as much or as little as you might require, so that you can satisfy your EU customers. The idea is to reduce the hassle for your EU customers when importing UK products. Basically, we want to help you to make it as simple as possible for your EU customers to buy a product from outside Europe. Because there is one thing for sure: if they were buying that same commodity within Europe, they wouldn't have to pay CBAM. So we need to try and make this as frictionless as possible by giving all the information that is required. I think it's important, as a benefit of working on CBAM properly, that you can identify areas to improve your emissions and making your products greener and therefore cheaper to be imported into the EU. And just to link back to what Liam said at the very beginning, it's not a bad idea to start understanding CBAM because the UK is implementing an equivalent scheme. So you as a company importing products from outside the UK will be having to do the same thing, gathering information and paying tax. So it's a good idea to start having that calculation, those calculations available. So that's the end for me. I just would like to invite you to use the QR code or the link underneath if you're interested, if you think that we can assist. It's a free CBAM health check, and the tool will gather some basic data, a list of commodity code, will tell you what's in scope and what's not in scope of the EU CBAM, and it will give you access to a free 30-minute consultation if you would like to get some of your questions answered. And then back to you, Liam.
Thank you very much, and thanks to our audience too for posing some really useful and interesting questions, which I'm now going to come to and pose to our two experts, to Victor and to Emmanuel. We'll start with an easy one, I hope, Victor. Nyla Thompson has asked, she's invalidated a Q3 report in their Netherlands branch. So that's an intercompany report. In error, can they reinstate the report? So in this system, is it possible to reinstate the report, or should they submit a new report, I guess is the question. Did you get that, Victor? Is Victor frozen? Have I frozen?
I don't know. Liam, what have you done? Have you pressed the freeze button?
No, I certainly have not. Are you able to answer that, Emmanuel? I do think Victor has frozen.
I think Victor is frozen. I would imagine that once you have invalidated the report,
yes,
you have to submit it again. But I'll let Victor confirm that.
Yeah, he'll come back to us. In the meantime, are you back, Victor? No, he's not. It's probably best to go out and come back in again. Usually that's the best approach.
The solution, yeah.
Yeah. Another simple one, I know you can answer this, Emmanuel, from Declan Horn. Are we able to pay a company to fulfill the CBAM requirements for us? Is that possible to do?
So if you're a UK company, by all means, that's I have met quite a lot of customers who said, it's not that I don't understand it, I don't want to understand it, please come in and help me. And we would be delighted to assist and to actually get to the point where you have all the information that you can simply, we can give you the sheet to send to your customer and it's all off your hands. We can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is, of course, you can buy services of all manner. Of course, you just have to pay for them. I'm going to come back to you, Victor. I think you're back in the room. You could hear us, but we couldn't hear you on that question of resubmitting a Q3 report for the Netherlands branch.
Indeed. Can you hear me well now?
Yes, you're coming through.
Great. So if the question was referring as a new importer, yes, you can still. So you can still submit or resubmit or basically amend an already submitted report via the CBAM registry. Of course, for all the reports than the last one, you will have to check with your own NCA if they allow you to do so. But for example, for the latest October report, you still have the whole of November to introduce amendments or corrections to the already submitted CBAM report.
Yeah, I mean, you did mention the Netherlands authority is maybe rather less flexible than most, but I think the message here from Victor's previous slides were that the responsibility is to submit the report. I don't think there's any issue if you're able to submit the report twice, or indeed write to the NCA concerned and just tell them you've invalidated the report with inadvertently, and submit the new data in writing to them. That's you showing every effort to submit the correct data. Thank you for that, Victor. So coming now to Gary Allen Roberts asks, is there currently any guidance or file that he can look at to show how to understand how to calculate our carbon value in our products. I guess this challenge is that businesses often buy commodities like steel and other materials on the open market, and getting a certificate from the mill to say what the embedded carbon is difficult. So Emmanuel and then Victor, because Victor, you did touch on this in terms of coming up with those values, but maybe answer that question. Is there something that you can do to where you don't have a carbon certificate that you can do to embed that, to understand the embedded carbon?
I mean, first of all, Liam, this is probably the most common problem and question that we are seeing every day. So in answer to Gary, yes, you can learn how to calculate what you are adding to the product. The problem is that you have bought a blank or a semi-finished product, and that comes in with carbon embedded, and you have to find out about that. Now, unfortunately, short of you calculating the emissions of the original product by going to visit the foreign factory, there isn't much you can do. And as Victor was saying, the EU will accept, depending on the national authority, deviation. But yes, it's unfortunately complex. You have to get the source information.
Yeah, and if you to answer that question, more widely, Victor, if you don't have source information, what's the methodology that Carbon Glance would suggest people apply?
I mean, in this case, it would be basically the same approach or the process that the Commission is mandating to follow, which is if you cannot provide actual data as an importer, you will have to provide justifications of why this has not been provided, and also provide proof of evidence of any efforts that have been done to collect this data from your suppliers. Now, coming back to if there are any supporting materials for you, at least to understand as a supplier what all this is about, there are some documents available within the Commission's website. There are some documents that they've made available, but of course, they are more on the theoretical part of things. There are some practical advices. But of course, if you want to go and check the whole set of equations that need to be applied for you to calculate your product's emissions, then you should go to the regulation itself. I can already tell that this is a very complex piece of legislation.
It is, because it's not just the precursor materials, it's all of the energy applied to the finished product, and also the opportunity to disregard some energy that's utilized within a factory, say, in the production process. So it's complex. I think take advice. There are experts out there. You don't need to be an expert too. You just need to be able to get someone that can give you that understanding. I guess we're trying to show that we're an example of someone that can help. Bert Zon has asked a really useful question too. Thanks, Bert. Does CBAM apply to every kilogram exported, or in fact, it's kilogram imported really, or is there a minimum quantity? And we've just seen the UK CBAM consultation result that's suggesting there's like a de minimis level if you import less than £50,000 in value of CBAM product into the UK. The expectation is that you can be disregarded. So is there any disregard or de minimis level for the EU, or is it every kilo that applies, Emmanuel?
Well, unfortunately, you have to report. If you're importing, you have to report back to the EU. So I'll let Victor come in with more detailed information, but for me, the answer is if you're importing CBAM products for business, you have to report.
Yeah, in practice, that's a reality because the minimis rule is actually minimis. It's if the value of your consignments, if the value of the CBAM goods within your consignments exceeds 150 euros, which is the most common situation, you will have to report under CBAM. So this basically covers any sort of import, because this rule is very small. The threshold is quite small.
Yeah, it is. And Associated Bert also asks, and thanks thanks to Chris for giving a response. But he asked, how do I make sure my supplier from India gives me the real data and not default data? And I think the challenge can often be, as Chris says, the mill should be able to provide the MTC with no trouble at all. Well, that's true if you buy directly from the mill or from a bona fides agent, but oftentimes people are buying commodities in the market. So is the short answer, change your supplier if they don't provide the data, because you're going to find it difficult to re-export into the EU? Or is there another answer, Emmanuel? You look poised to
I
tell.
think, yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, the problem is you're not going to know. You're not going to know. You're going to rely on information that you're not going to know. Now, I can tell you two things. One, in terms of compliance, having a reporting methodology written and approved within your company is vital, because in that methodology, you will track where you got the information from, and you will have proof from where the information came from. So in the very unfortunate event that somebody should audit you, and then they should find that your figures are incorrect, at least you have all the tools in place, all the evidence, the audit trail to show that you're relying on external information. The other thing that is very useful is that using tools like Carbon Glance, for example, allows you to compare when you put in a commodity code, the default energy reading, the default carbon reading expected as average with what you're importing. So if suddenly you have a much lower value or a much higher value, this gets flagged, and at least you know before anybody finds out, and you can actually question your supplier. I had that example when we had actual data and the information we received was swapped, direct and indirect was swapped. They did not match, and it was flagged, and it was quite easy to see, and we queried it before it became a problem.
Yeah. Look, I'm conscious of time now. We've got about 6 minutes to go, and I'm going to turn to some manufacturers here and conflate two questions. Chris Patey says, I use aluminium smelted and rolled in Spain. I buy this in using a metal distributor in the UK. They then call off the order from them as and when they require for manufacture. They then export the products into the EU using an importer of record, a third party that facilitates that, and they don't understand why they had a bill for CBAM where our production processes don't produce any carbon, i.e. the carbon's already embedded in the aluminium from Spain. It's the mill, isn't it the mill that should be responsible for this? So hold that thought. Then I want to come to Felicity Marshall, who similarly is manufacturing, assembling, that assembles items, and we use cast aluminium or sheet metal in some of our products. So the product has aluminium sheet metal in it. However, the commodity code that they export under don't apply to the finished goods, right? So if you look at the commodity codes that do apply, those finished goods have got a different commodity code. Does CBAM apply to us if our commodity code isn't included in the list? So Emmanuel's just answered it by the shake of a head on that second.
Sorry, you know I do that all the time.
Yeah. So maybe just take that those two questions together. So one is, if the finished product doesn't come in with the commodity codes, does CBAM apply? The other one is, why is my intermediary charging me for CBAM calculator for CBAM when which is a bit odd because there's no charge for CBAM right now. There's no ETSs that are required to be paid. Shouldn't it go back to the original bill, go to the mill that produced the aluminium?
So let's do the second one because it's easy. If the final product has a commodity code that does not fall within the list of CBAM products, you're off the hook.
Yeah.
And we've seen that with signal generators where the empty aluminium box would have been within the scope, but once they get transformed into a signal generator and there is some electronics put in it, and the commodity code changed from a 70 odd to an 80 odd, the product is no longer within the scope. It's because these are industrial level quantities, right? So that's one answer. And Victor, if I'm incorrect, please jump in and correct me. The second point, I like it very much. First of all, why are you paying? I agree with you, Liam. Why are you paying anybody this? Don't pay anybody. The Nobody's getting charged for CBAM imports yet, so you shouldn't be paying.
What you may be paying for is the administration of the calculation in some form that intermediary is applying, but you shouldn't be paying. So they may be taking it off your hands and saying, "Look, I'll do it all for you," in which case they're going to charge you a service fee for that. But you're not paying any ETSs right now.
It is interesting. If the metal came from Spain and then came to the UK and then went back to Spain, there is a mechanism which Victor can expand on, but there is a mechanism to recognize any carbon tax that's already been paid to actually offset it. But unless we can follow that mechanism, just the fact that the metal comes from Europe does not change anything. The fact that it's left Europe and it goes back into Europe does not exempt those initial emissions. And Victor, if you want to expand on that.
And you've just I'm really conscious of time. I think we've kind of dealt with that, and actually I think you've also answered Darren Baxter's question, which was about the offsetting, and so there is an offsetting mechanism that needs to be applied. Can I just say that, you know, given we've got only a few seconds to go, we're going to finish off with a question from Stuart Young. The other questions we haven't got to yet, Heidi has captured them, and we will come back to you with an answer on those remaining questions. I think we've got 10 open. We're going to do one and then finish up to get people back to their workstations in time. Stuart Young's question, really simple one for you, Victor. Will this be the same process when the UK CBAM comes into play?
That's an interesting question. So the UK CBAM has already been announced, indeed, for 2027. It is likely that there will be, well, we know already that there will be certain differences between the UK CBAM and the EU CBAM, and that's why it's super relevant that each company keep tracks of the different changes. But we should expect the UK CBAM to have differences in the measurement rules that are yet to be, of course, embedded into law. Once that happens, we can definitely give you a definitive answer on that. But importantly, the sectors that will be covered by the UK CBAM will be very similar to the ones currently covered by the EU CBAM, because glass and ceramics, which were initially expected to be included under the scope of the UK CBAM, have been excluded.
Thank you very much, Victor, for your questions. And as I said, there's a number of questions still open, 9 of them in total. I've had a read through them. We will come back to you on those, from everything from merchandise and baggage to other grants available to help with CBAM consultancy and third country imports and so on. So we'll come back to that. We'll also share those answers with everyone who's on here, as well as a link to the video content. It goes without saying, of course, that we are available to help you. We do have a consultancy and advisory service at Chamber Customs, and we're doing work with a number of companies in the UK, led by Emmanuel, on providing those services. And as this is quite a new thing, there isn't anybody out there that's got years of experience on CBAM, but there are people like Victor and his colleagues who've got very long experience and knowledge on the whole issue around carbon accounting and the like. And so we're working with other partners and being able to deliver those services. It remains for me to say thank you to Victor and Emmanuel for their support. Please remember to click on that link and do a little bit of a health check. It'll take you 5 minutes, but it will reveal to you where you may have sensitivities in your understanding, or you may need to go and dig out some information or seek help. And I look forward to tomorrow's webinar on how to utilise authorisations around customs warehousing and other matters. If you haven't already signed up for that and it's of interest to you, then please do so. Thank you very much.